Between March and November of 1872, 14 different medical procedures were performed on patient number 47 at Whitmore Asylum in Manchester, New Hampshire. Each treatment was designed to be fatal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Each one failed. By the time the staff realized what they were dealing with, 3 doctors had vanished, 2 nurses had gone completely insane, and the patient himself had become something that medical science could not explain or contain. The fade. Autumn of 1872 brought an unusual chill to the granite hills of southern New Hampshire. Manchester was a bustling mill town then, its red brick factories lining the Merrimack River like sleeping giants. Steam rose from countless chimneys, and the sound of textile machinery filled the air from dawn to dusk. But on the outskirts of town, where the maple trees burned red and gold against the gray October sky, stood a building that most residents preferred to forget existed. Whitmore Asylum for the Criminal Insane had been built in 1858. A massive structure of local granite that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. 4 stories tall with barred windows that stared blindly across the surrounding countryside. It housed those unfortunate souls that society deemed too dangerous for regular hospitals or prisons. The building sat on 30 acres of cleared land, surrounded by a stone wall 12 feet high and topped with iron spikes that gleamed wickedly in the sun. Dr. Edmund Blackwood had been the head physician at Whitmore for 8 years when the patient arrived who would change everything. Blackwood was a man of science, educated at Harvard Medical College, with a reputation for innovative treatments of mental disorders. He believed firmly in the new theories of alienism, the idea that madness could be cured through proper medical intervention. His methods were considered progressive for the time, though they would seem barbaric by modern standards. The asylum itself was a marvel of Victorian institutional architecture. The main building contained administrative offices on the ground floor, patient wards on the 2nd and 3rd floors, and treatment rooms in the basement. A separate wing housed the most violent patients in solitary cells lined with cork to muffle their screams. The entire complex was heated by a massive boiler system that ran through tunnels beneath the building, creating a network of passages that few people knew existed. The staff at Whitmore consisted of 12 attendants, 6 nurses, 3 doctors, and the director, Dr. Blackwood himself. They dealt with 48 patients in total, ranging from melancholia to violent mania. The asylum operated on strict schedules, with treatments administered at precise times, meals served at regular intervals, and lights extinguished at 9 o'clock sharp every evening. Manchester itself was a city of contrasts in 1870. 2. The wealthy mill owners lived in grand Victorian mansions on Elm Street, while the factory workers crowded into tenement buildings near the river. The city boasted 3 newspapers, 2 theaters, and a new railroad station that connected it to Boston and points north. But even in this progressive industrial center, there were things that people whispered about only in the darkness of taverns or the safety of their own homes. The Merrimack River that powered the mills had a history older than the factories that lined its banks. The Pennacook Indians who once lived along its waters spoke of spirits that dwelt beneath the surface, hungry things that could take human form when the need arose. They had sacred sites along the river where they left offerings to appease these spirits, sites that were now buried beneath factory foundations and city streets. Old-timers in Manchester remembered stories their grandparents had told about the land where Whitmore Asylum now stood. Before the asylum, there had been a Shaker community there, a group of religious separatists who believed in the possibility of human perfection. The Shakers had built their settlement in 1823, clearing the land and constructing simple wooden buildings where they practiced their austere faith. The Shaker community had prospered for nearly 20 years, their members known throughout the region for their craftsmanship and their strange dancing worship services. But in 1842, something had gone terribly wrong. Within the span of 3 months, every member of the community had either died or disappeared. The official records blamed disease, but local farmers spoke of other things. Lights seen moving through the woods at night, sounds that weren't quite human echoing across the fields, and the discovery of symbols carved into trees, symbols that seemed to writhe and change when viewed directly. When the state decided to build an asylum on the abandoned Shaker land, there were protests from some of the older residents. They claimed the land was cursed, that whatever had driven away the Shakers still lingered there. But the location was perfect for an asylum, isolated enough to keep the patients away from the general population, yet close enough to the city for supplies and staff. Construction began in 1856, and the first patients arrived 2 years later. Dr. Blackwood had heard the stories about the land, of course, but he was a man of science who put little stock in superstition. He had more pressing concerns than local folklore. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The asylum was overcrowded, understaffed, and constantly struggling with insufficient funding from the state. His patients ranged from harmless individuals, suffering from what would now be recognized as depression or anxiety, to truly dangerous criminals whose minds had snapped under the weight of their crimes. The treatment methods available to Dr. Blackwood were limited by the medical knowledge of the time. Water therapy was popular, involving everything from cold baths to high-pressure sprays, designed to shock patients back to sanity. Mechanical restraints were used liberally, with patients strapped to spinning chairs or confined in straight whiskets for hours at a time. More extreme treatments included bloodletting, trepanation, and the administration of various drugs and poisons in carefully measured doses. The staff at Whitmore worked under difficult conditions. The pay was poor, the hours were long, and the work was both physically and emotionally demanding. Attendants were often former soldiers or factory workers who needed employment and weren't particularly squeamish about the methods used on patients. The nurses were typically unmarried women from respectable families who had chosen this profession out of a sense of Christian duty or simple economic necessity. Among the staff was Margaret Collins, a young woman of 26 who had come to work at Whitmore after her father's death left her family in financial distress. Margaret was known for her compassion toward the patients, often spending extra time with those who seemed capable of improvement. She had gentle hands and a soft voice that could calm even the most agitated individuals. There was also Thomas Brennan, the head attendant, a massive Irishman who had served in the Union Army during the recent war. Brennan had seen enough violence to last several lifetimes, but he had never encountered anything that disturbed him as much as what he would witness at Whitmore in the months to come. His strength was legendary among the staff, and he prided himself on being able to handle any patient, no matter how violent or unpredictable. Dr. Henry Morrison served as Blackwood's assistant, a nervous young man fresh from medical school who had taken the position at Whitmore because no other opportunities were available to him. Morrison believed deeply in the healing power of medicine, and he approached each case with an optimism that would soon be severely tested. The daily routine at Whitmore began before dawn, when the night attendants would wake the day staff and report on any incidents that had occurred during the dark hours. Patients were roused at 6 o'clock for breakfast, a simple meal of porridge, bread, and weak coffee served in the common dining hall under the watchful eyes of the attendants. After breakfast came the first round of treatments, followed by a period of exercise in the courtyard for those patients deemed safe enough to leave their cells. Lunch was served at noon, followed by more treatments, and then a rest period during the hottest part of the day. Evening brought another meal and a final round of treatments before the patients were locked in their cells for the night. The schedule never varied, as Dr. Blackwood believed that routine was essential for the treatment of mental disorders. The treatment rooms in the basement of Whitmore were equipped with the latest in medical apparatus. There were baths for hydrotherapy, mechanical devices for restraint and correction, and a small operating theater where more invasive procedures could be performed. The rooms were lined with white tile that could be easily cleaned, and gas lamps provided bright illumination for the doctor's work. It was into this world of rigid routine and experimental medicine that patient number 47 arrived on the morning of March 15, 1872. The patient came with no name, no history, and no explanation of how he had come to be in the custody of the state authorities. He appeared to be a man of perhaps 30 years, though his exact age was impossible to determine. He was of average height and build, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to look through rather than at the people around him. What was most remarkable about the new patient was his complete lack of response to any stimulus. He did not speak, did not react to pain or pleasure, did not seem to register the presence of other people. He would sit motionless for hours if left alone, staring at nothing with those dark, empty eyes. When moved, he would remain in whatever position he was placed, like a mannequin in a shop window. Dr. Blackwood was intrigued by this new case. He had seen catatonic patients before, individuals who had withdrawn so completely from reality that they seemed almost dead while still breathing. But there was something different about this patient, something that made the doctor's scientific curiosity overcome his usual caution. The first attempts at treatment were standard procedures: cold water baths to shock the system, mechanical stimulation to provoke a response, and various medications designed to stimulate the nervous system. Nothing worked. The patient remained as motionless and unresponsive as ever, his dark eyes staring at something that only he could see. Margaret Collins was assigned to care for the new patient, and she found herself drawn to him in a way that she couldn't explain. There was something about his stillness that reminded her of a deep pond calm, on the surface but hiding unknown depths beneath. She would sit with him during her breaks, talking quietly about her day or reading aloud from books of poetry, hoping that some part of him might hear and respond. Thomas Brennan was less charitable in his assessment of patient 47. The big Irishman had dealt with all manner of dangerous criminals and violent madmen, but something about this particular patient made his skin crawl. There was an intensity to the man's stillness that suggested not absence, but presence, as if he were not withdrawing from the world, but studying it with the patience of a predator. Dr. Morrison approached the case with scientific enthusiasm, convinced that the right combination of treatments would eventually break through the patient's catatonic state. He spent hours studying medical texts, looking for references to similar cases and experimental procedures that might prove effective. As the weeks passed and the patient remained unresponsive to all conventional treatments, Dr. Blackwood began to consider more extreme measures. The field of alienism was advancing rapidly, and there were new theories about the physical basis of mental disorders that suggested more aggressive interventions might be necessary. The first of what would become known as the 14 treatments was administered on a gray morning in early April. Dr. Blackwood had decided to attempt trepanation, the ancient practice of drilling holes in the skull to relieve pressure on the brain. The procedure was performed in the basement operating theater, with Dr. Morrison assisting and Margaret Collins providing nursing care. The patient was strapped to the operating table, though his usual immobility made the restraints seem unnecessary. Dr. Blackwood marked the location for the incision and began to work, his drill biting into the bone with a sound like grinding stone. Blood flowed freely, staining the white tiles, but the patient showed no sign of pain or distress. When the hole was complete and the piece of skull removed, Dr. Blackwood peered into the opening with scientific fascination. The brain tissue beneath appeared normal, pulsing gently with the rhythm of life. But as he watched, something extraordinary happened. The tissue began to heal, growing back together before his eyes, forcing the piece of skull upward until it popped free of the surrounding bone. Within minutes, the patient's head was completely healed, without even a scar to mark where the drill had penetrated. Dr. Blackwood stared in amazement, unable to believe what he had witnessed. Margaret Collins crossed herself and whispered a prayer, while Dr. Morrison frantically made notes in his medical journal. The patient himself remained unchanged, his dark eyes staring at nothing, his body motionless on the operating table. Whatever had just occurred, he seemed no more aware of it than he was of anything else around him. Dr. Blackwood removed the restraints and helped the patient to a sitting position. The man's head was completely normal, the hair already growing back over the spot where the trepanation had been performed. There was no sign that any medical procedure had taken place at all. That night, Dr. Blackwood sat in his office long after the rest of the staff had gone home, trying to make sense of what he had seen. Medical science had no explanation for spontaneous healing on such a scale. The human body simply did not regenerate tissue that quickly or completely. Yet he had witnessed it with his own eyes, and both Dr. Morrison and Margaret Collins could confirm what had happened. The next morning brought disturbing news. One of the night attendants, a man named Patrick O'Sullivan, had not reported for his shift. A search of the asylum revealed no trace of him, though his coat was found hanging in the staff room and his personal belongings remained in his locker. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. The disappearance of Patrick O'Sullivan marked the beginning of a series of events that would transform Whitmore Asylum from a place of healing into something far more sinister. But at the time, Dr. Blackwood was too fascinated by his unusual patient to pay much attention to one missing attendant. The second treatment was attempted a week later, a procedure involving electrical stimulation of the nervous system. Crude batteries were used to send jolts of current through the patient's body, a treatment that was known to provoke violent convulsions in normal individuals. Once again, the patient showed no response whatsoever, his body absorbing the electrical energy without any visible effect. But something else happened during that second treatment that would haunt Margaret Collins for the rest of her life. As the electrical current flowed through the patient's body, she could have sworn she saw his lips move, forming silent words in a language that sounded ancient and terrible. When she mentioned this to Dr. Blackwood, he dismissed it as her imagination, but Margaret knew what she had seen. The treatments continued, each one more extreme than the last, and each one ending in failure. The patient remained unchanged, his dark eyes staring at nothing, his body healing any damage inflicted upon it with impossible speed. And with each failed treatment, another member of the staff would vanish without explanation. By the time autumn arrived in Manchester, Whitmore Asylum had become a place where even the bravest attendants feared to work the night shift, where strange sounds echoed through the corridors after dark, and where patient number 47 continued his motionless vigil, waiting for something that only he understood. The third treatment came on a rain-soaked Thursday in late April, when the asylum's corridors echoed with the sound of water dripping from broken gutters. Dr. Blackwood had decided to attempt a procedure he had read about in a German medical journal, one that involved the administration of strychnine in carefully controlled doses. The poison was known to cause violent muscular contractions that sometimes shocked catatonic patients back to awareness. Margaret Collins prepared the injection with trembling hands, her usual composure shaken by the events of the past weeks. 3 more staff members had vanished since Patrick O'Sullivan's disappearance, each one simply failing to appear for their assigned shifts. Their personal belongings remained untouched, but the people themselves had evaporated like morning mist. The remaining staff whispered nervously among themselves, some claiming to have heard footsteps in empty corridors and voices speaking in languages that predated English by centuries. The patient sat motionless in the treatment chair as Dr. Morrison secured the leather restraints around his wrists and ankles. His dark eyes remained fixed on some distant point that only he could perceive, his breathing so shallow it was barely detectable. When Dr. Blackwood inserted the needle into the patient's arm, there was no reaction, no flinch or acknowledgement of pain. The strychnine entered his bloodstream with the efficiency of modern medicine, yet the expected convulsions never came. Instead, something far more disturbing occurred. The patient's skin began to change color, taking on a grayish pallor that reminded Margaret of winter ice. His breathing stopped entirely, and for nearly 10 minutes, all vital signs ceased. Dr. Blackwood checked for a pulse repeatedly, finding nothing but cold, still flesh. Then, as suddenly as it had stopped, the patient's heart began beating again. Color returned to his skin, his breathing resumed its barely perceptible rhythm, and his dark eyes continued their eternal stare. The strychnine had been completely neutralized, processed by a metabolism that seemed to operate according to rules unknown to medical science. Thomas Brennan, who had been watching from the doorway, later told his wife that he had seen something move beneath the patient's skin during those 10 minutes of apparent death. Something that writhed and twisted, like serpents made of shadow, visible only from the corner of his eye. When he looked directly, there was nothing but pale, motionless flesh. Dr. Morrison documented everything with obsessive precision, filling page after page with measurements, observations, and theories. He had begun to suspect that they were dealing with something beyond the scope of conventional medicine, though he dared not voice such thoughts to his superior. Dr. Blackwood remained convinced that science would eventually provide an explanation for the patient's condition. The fourth treatment involved the application of extreme cold, a method that had shown promise in treating certain forms of mania. The patient was placed in a bath filled with ice water drawn from the Merrimack River, his body temperature lowered to levels that should have induced immediate cardiac arrest. For 3 hours he remained submerged to his neck in water so cold that ice crystals formed on the surface. Margaret Collins monitored his vital signs throughout the procedure, watching in growing horror as his body temperature dropped far below what any human being could survive. His lips turned blue, then black, and his fingernails took on the color of deep bruises. Yet his heart continued beating with mechanical regularity, and his lungs continued their shallow rhythm of breath. When they finally removed him from the ice bath, his body was rigid with cold, his skin so pale it seemed translucent. But within minutes of being wrapped in heated blankets, warmth returned to his extremities, color flooded back into his face, and once again he appeared completely unharmed by an ordeal that should have killed him. The pattern was becoming clear to those brave enough to see it. Each treatment that should have provoked a response failed completely. Each procedure that should have caused death was survived without apparent effort. And with each failed attempt, another member of the asylum staff would disappear into the New Hampshire night. Dr. Blackwood began to keep a private journal, separate from the official medical records. In it, he recorded not just the clinical details of each treatment, but also the strange incidents that seemed to follow in their wake. Patients in other wards reported nightmares filled with ancient symbols and voices speaking in tongues that hurt to hear. Attendants found their equipment moved or damaged in ways that defied explanation. The asylum's cats, which had previously helped control the mouse population, fled the building entirely and could not be coaxed back inside. The fifth treatment was administered on the first day of May, when spring flowers bloomed in the asylums. Neglected gardens and birdsong filled the morning air. Dr. Blackwood had decided to attempt surgical removal of a portion of the patient's brain, a radical procedure that he hoped might reveal the source of the man's unusual condition. The operation was performed in the basement theater with full surgical protocol. The patient's head was shaved and prepared, incisions were made with precision, and a section of skull was carefully removed to expose the brain tissue beneath. What Dr. Blackwood found there challenged everything he thought he knew about human anatomy. The patient's brain appeared normal at first glance, but as the doctor began to probe deeper, he discovered structures that should not have existed. Vessels that pulsed with fluid darker than blood, tissue that seemed to regenerate even as he cut into it, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be symbols etched into the brain matter itself. The symbols moved and shifted when observed directly, forming patterns that hurt to look at and seemed to whisper meanings too terrible to comprehend. Dr. Morrison, who was assisting with the surgery, later claimed that he had seen the symbols spell out words in an ancient script that preceded all known languages. He began researching historical texts, spending his free time in the Manchester library poring over volumes that dealt with folklore and mythology rather than medical science. Margaret Collins, who had been monitoring the patient's vital signs during the surgery, reported that his heartbeat had begun to synchronize with hers, and that she had felt compelled to hum a melody that she had never heard before. The tune stayed with her for days afterward, haunting her dreams and causing her to wake with the taste of copper in her mouth. The surgery itself was a technical success. The brain tissue was removed, examined, and documented with photographic plates that Dr. Blackwood hoped to present to medical conferences in Boston and New York. But when they prepared to close the incision, they discovered that the brain had already regenerated the missing tissue. The symbols were gone, replaced by perfectly normal gray matter that showed no sign of having been disturbed. The sixth treatment came a week later, when Dr. Blackwood decided to attempt complete exsanguination, the removal of all blood from the patient's body. It was a procedure that had been used in medieval times as a supposed cure for various ailments, though it invariably resulted in death. The doctor hoped that such extreme measures might finally provoke some kind of response. The patient was prepared in the usual manner, restrained and positioned for optimal access to his major blood vessels. Incisions were made in his arms and legs, and the blood was allowed to drain into collection vessels while Dr. Morrison carefully monitored the process. What emerged was not the bright red blood of a healthy human being, but a dark, viscous fluid that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. As the strange blood drained away, the patient's body began to desiccate like an ancient mummy. His skin tightened against his bones, his eyes sank deep into their sockets, and his breathing became so faint as to be undetectable. For nearly 6 hours he remained in this mummified state while the staff watched in fascination and growing dread. Then, as the sun set over the New Hampshire hills, something extraordinary occurred. The dark blood began to flow back into the patient's body through the very incisions that had been made to drain it. His desiccated flesh plumped with returning fluid, his eyes regained their normal appearance, and his breathing resumed its usual shallow rhythm. Within minutes, he appeared exactly as he had before the procedure began. Thomas Brennan, who had been assigned to dispose of the collected blood, made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The collection vessels were empty, though he had seen them filled with that dark, unnatural fluid. More disturbing still, he found bloody handprints on the basement walls, prints that matched no one currently employed at the asylum. The prints appeared to have been made by hands that had been dipped in the patient's blood, and they formed a pattern that seemed to point toward the deepest parts of the building's foundation. Dr. Morrison began to research the history of the land on which Whitmore Asylum had been built. He discovered records of the Shaker community that had preceded the asylum, and learned about their sudden disappearance in 1842. He found references to strange incidents that had occurred even before the Shakers arrived. Stories told by the Pennacook Indians about spirits that dwelt beneath the ground and fed on human life force. The seventh treatment was administered on a night when thunder rolled across the New Hampshire sky and lightning illuminated the asylum's barred windows with stark white light. Dr. Blackwood had decided to attempt electrocution using the most powerful electrical apparatus available, hoping that massive electrical shock might finally break through the patient's mysterious defenses. The equipment was assembled in the basement treatment room, crude but powerful batteries connected to metal plates that would deliver current directly to the patient's body. The voltage was sufficient to power the asylum's lighting system, far more than any human body could survive. As the electrical current surged through the patient's flesh, the lights throughout the asylum began to flicker and dim. The very air seemed to crackle with energy, and Margaret Collins later reported that she could taste metal and feel her hair standing on end despite being several feet away from the apparatus. The patient's body convulsed once, a single violent spasm that seemed to shake the entire building. Then, impossibly, he began to absorb the electrical energy like a lightning rod drawing power from a storm. The batteries drained completely, their energy flowing into the patient's motionless form, yet he showed no sign of injury or distress. When the procedure was complete and the equipment shut down, Dr. Blackwood made a chilling discovery. The patient's eyes, which had always stared at nothing, were now focused directly on him. For just a moment, those dark pupils seemed to hold intelligence, purpose, and something that might have been amusement. Then the moment passed, and the patient returned to his usual catatonic state. That night, 2 more staff members vanished. The night nurse, Sarah Whitman, and the security guard, James Fletcher, simply failed to complete their shifts. Their absence was discovered at dawn when the day staff arrived to find empty corridors and unattended patients. A search of the asylum revealed nothing but their abandoned posts and a lingering scent that reminded Margaret Collins of copper pennies and old grave dirt. Dr. Morrison began to piece together a theory that he dared not share with his colleagues. The patient, he believed, was not suffering from any known form of mental illness. Instead, he appeared to be something else entirely, something that had taken human form but operated according to rules that predated modern understanding of biology and medicine. The 8th treatment involved the administration of mercury, a substance known for its toxic properties and its supposed ability to purge illness from the body. Large quantities of the liquid metal were introduced into the patient's system through various means, enough to poison a dozen normal men. The mercury had no visible effect on the patient's condition, but it had a profound impact on the asylum itself. The building's metal fixtures began to tarnish and corrode at an accelerated rate. Brass doorknobs turned green with verdigris overnight. Iron bars on the windows developed rust that seemed to spread like a disease, and the copper pipes that carried water throughout the building began to leak a substance that was neither water nor mercury but something altogether more sinister. The 9th treatment was perhaps the most extreme yet attempted. Dr. Blackwood decided to try complete dismemberment, the surgical removal of the patient's limbs to see if his remarkable healing abilities extended to regenerating entire appendages. The procedure was performed with clinical precision, each limb carefully severed and removed from the body. What followed defied all rational explanation. The severed limbs remained warm and showed signs of independent life, fingers moving occasionally as if grasping for something just out of reach. The patient's torso, meanwhile, began the process of regeneration immediately, new limbs growing from the severed stumps with the speed of time-lapse photography. Within 12 hours, the patient was whole again, his new limbs identical to the originals in every detail. The severed appendages, however, had crumbled to dust that scattered when touched, leaving only faint stains on the laboratory floor that resembled ancient symbols drawn in charcoal and ash. Dr. Morrison documented everything with increasing desperation, his handwriting becoming more erratic with each failed treatment. He had begun to suspect that the patient was not being cured because there was nothing wrong with him in any conventional sense. Instead, he appeared to be something that had chosen to remain motionless, something that was allowing these procedures to be performed for reasons that remained hidden. Margaret Collins, meanwhile, had begun to experience vivid dreams in which she walked through corridors that were similar to those of Whitmore Asylum, but far older and more elaborate. In these dreams, she encountered figures dressed in simple Shaker clothing who warned her about something terrible that slept beneath. The building, something that fed on human suffering and grew stronger with each life it consumed. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. The treatments were not failing because they were inadequate, but because the patient was something that could not be harmed by conventional means. Each procedure seemed to strengthen rather than weaken him, and each failed attempt was followed by the disappearance of staff members who ventured too close to the truth. Thomas Brennan began to carry a loaded revolver at all times, though he suspected that conventional weapons would prove as useless as conventional medicine. He had seen enough in his years at the asylum to convince him that they were dealing with something that existed outside the normal laws of nature, something that had been waiting beneath the New Hampshire soil for decades before finally revealing itself. The 10th treatment would prove to be a turning point, though none of them realized it at the time. As autumn approached and the leaves began to turn their brilliant colors, Dr. Blackwood prepared for what he hoped would be the most decisive intervention yet attempted, unaware that each failed treatment was bringing them closer to a revelation that would change everything they thought they knew about life, death, and the spaces between them. The 10th treatment began on the morning when Margaret Collins made the discovery that would unravel everything Dr. Blackwood thought he understood about patient number 47. She had arrived early for her shift, hoping to complete her rounds before the usual chaos of the day began. The autumn air was crisp with the promise of winter, and frost covered the asylum grounds like a delicate shroud. As Margaret walked through the basement corridors toward the treatment rooms, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Wet footprints led from the patient's cell toward the deepest parts of the building, footprints that were too large to belong to any current staff member and appeared to have been made by bare feet. The prints glistened in the gaslight, not with water but with something darker and more viscous. Following the trail against every instinct screaming at her to flee, Margaret descended stairs she had never seen before, stairs that seemed to have been carved directly from the bedrock beneath the asylum. The air grew colder with each step, and she began to hear sounds that had no place in any medical facility. Whispers in languages that predated English, the scraping of stone against stone, and beneath it all, a rhythmic chanting that seemed to pulse with the beating of her own heart. The trail led to a chamber that existed far below the asylum's official basement level. The room was circular, its walls covered with symbols that hurt to look at directly. They seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering light of torches that burned without any visible fuel source. In the center of the chamber stood an altar made of black stone, its surface stained with substances that Margaret preferred not to identify, but it was what surrounded the altar that truly horrified her. Arranged in perfect circles were the missing staff members, or what remained of them. Patrick O'Sullivan, Sarah Whitman, James Fletcher, and all the others who had vanished over the past months. They stood motionless, their eyes open but vacant, their skin pale as parchment. They breathed, their hearts beat, but there was nothing human left in their empty gazes. At the altar's center knelt patient 47, no longer the motionless figure she had known for months. His dark eyes blazed with an intelligence that was ancient and terrible, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. The words were in a language that Margaret had never heard before, yet somehow she understood their meaning. He was calling to something that slept beneath the earth, something that had been waiting for the proper rituals to awaken it from its long slumber. Margaret tried to flee, but found her feet rooted to the stone floor, as if they had grown there. The patient's gaze fell upon her, and she felt her will dissolve like sugar in rain. He gestured toward the circle of empty-eyed staff members, and she realized with growing horror that this had been their fate. They had been transformed into vessels, hollow shells that served the patient's mysterious purpose. The truth crashed over her like a freezing wave. Patient 47 had never been ill or catatonic. He had been planning, gathering strength, and using the medical treatments as a form of ritual sacrifice. Each procedure had fed him energy. Each failed treatment had brought him closer to his ultimate goal. The asylum staff who had vanished had not fled or died, but had been converted into servants of something far older and more malevolent than human madness. Above them, Dr. Blackwood was preparing for what he believed would be the most important treatment of his career. He had spent weeks researching ancient medical texts, looking for precedents for the patient's condition. What he had found disturbed him more than he cared to admit. References to individuals who could not be killed by conventional means appeared throughout history, always associated with disappearances, madness, and the collapse of entire communities. Dr. Morrison burst into Blackwood's office with eyes wild with excitement and terror. He had made his own discoveries in the Manchester Library, poring over historical documents that referenced the land beneath the asylum. The Pennacook Indians had called it the place of endless hunger, a site where spirits from the world below could cross into the realm of the living. The Shaker community had built their settlement there, specifically to contain something they believed was awakening. But their efforts had failed catastrophically. The Shakers had not simply died or disappeared, Morrison explained breathlessly. They had been transformed, converted into guardians for something that slept beneath their meeting house. When the state had built the asylum on the same site, they had unknowingly created the perfect environment for that ancient hunger to manifest once again. Thomas Brennan had made his own disturbing discovery in the asylum's personnel records. Every staff member who had vanished could be traced to a specific interaction with patient 47. They had all been present during his treatments, had all been exposed to whatever emanated from his presence during the procedures. The pattern suggested that the patient was not randomly selecting victims, but was systematically recruiting individuals who possessed certain qualities he required. Dr. Blackwood refused to believe what his assistant was telling him. He was a man of science, educated in the finest medical institutions, trained to find rational explanations for even the most unusual phenomena. The idea that his patient was some kind of supernatural entity was absurd, a return to the superstitious thinking that modern medicine had supposedly left behind. But as he prepared the equipment for the 10th treatment, doubts began to creep into his mind. The patient's ability to heal from any injury was beyond medical explanation. His apparent immunity to poisons and diseases defied everything Blackwood understood about human physiology. Most disturbing of all was the way the man's presence seemed to affect the very atmosphere of the asylum, creating an environment where rational thought became increasingly difficult to maintain. The 10th treatment involved the application of Kofanyem, extreme heat, temperature sufficient to cook human flesh. The patient was strapped to a metal table that had been heated to glowing red, his body exposed to heat that should have killed him instantly. Yet he remained motionless and apparently unharmed, his flesh refusing to burn despite temperatures that would have reduced a normal person to ash. As the treatment progressed, something unprecedented occurred. The patient began to speak, not in the wordless murmurings that Margaret had sometimes imagined, but in clear, precise English that carried an accent unlike anything Dr. Blackwood had ever heard. The words formed themselves into sentences that described things no sane person would ever want to hear. He spoke of the time before time, when the earth was young and things that were not quite alive walked beneath its surface. He described civilizations that had risen and fallen before humans had learned to make fire, races of beings that had fed on suffering and grown strong on the life force of lesser creatures. He told of gateways between worlds, thin places where the barriers between reality and nightmare grew permeable. Most terrifying of all, he explained why he had come to Whitmore Asylum. The treatments, the procedures, the systematic application of pain and medical intervention had all been part of an elaborate ritual. Each failed attempt to cure him had actually been a successful step in a process designed to weaken the barriers between worlds. The asylum, built on ground already consecrated to ancient hungers, had become a focus point for energies that most humans could not even comprehend. Dr. Morrison, who had been monitoring the patient's vital signs during the heat treatment, noticed something that made his hands shake as he recorded the data. The patient's heartbeat was synchronizing with seismic activity detected by instruments. At Dartmouth College, 40 miles away, minor earthquakes were occurring in perfect rhythm with the man's pulse, as if his very life force was connected to geological processes on a scale that dwarfed human understanding. Margaret Collins, meanwhile, remained trapped in the underground chamber, watching in horrified fascination as the patient continued his ritual. The missing staff members had begun to move in unison, their empty eyes reflecting the torchlight. As they swayed to rhythms that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself, their mouths opened and closed in silent screams, as if they were trying to warn her of something too terrible to voice. The symbols on the chamber walls had begun to glow with their own internal light, pulsing in time with the patient's heartbeat. Far above, Margaret could feel the stone floor vibrating beneath her feet, and hairline cracks appeared in the walls as whatever slept beneath the asylum began to stir in response to the ritual. Back in the treatment room, Dr. Blackwood made a discovery that shattered his rational worldview completely. As the patient spoke, his words began to have a physical effect on the people around him. Dr. Morrison's hair had begun to turn white, aging years with each sentence. The metal instruments in the room had started to corrode and crumble, as if centuries were passing in minutes. Most disturbing of all, Dr. Blackwood found that he could understand not just the patient's words, but the meaning behind them. Knowledge was flowing into his mind, information about the true nature of reality that human consciousness was never meant to process. He learned about the spaces between atoms where other forms of life existed, about dimensions that intersected with the physical world at specific locations and times. The patient explained that the 11 treatments had been necessary to prepare the ground, to create the proper resonance between his physical form and the forces that waited below. Each procedure had been a note in a symphony of pain and healing, building toward a crescendo that would tear open the barriers between worlds. But 3 more treatments were required to complete the process. The patient's eyes, which had remained fixed on distant visions throughout his months at the asylum, now focused directly on Dr. Blackwood with an intensity that seemed to burn through flesh and bone. He explained that the doctor himself had been chosen for this purpose, selected not for his medical skill, but for his stubborn refusal to accept supernatural explanations. The patient needed someone who would continue the treatments, even when faced with evidence that they were serving a purpose beyond medical science. Dr. Blackwood's rationality, his desperate need to find scientific explanations for impossible phenomena, had made him the perfect unwitting collaborator in a plan that had been centuries in the making. Thomas Brennan, realizing that something had gone terribly wrong, burst into the treatment room with his revolver drawn. What he found there challenged everything he thought he understood about the nature of reality. The patient was no longer restrained, though the metal table remained glowing hot beneath him. He stood in the center of the room, his body radiating heat that should have been impossible for human flesh to contain. Dr. Blackwood and Dr. Morrison stood motionless nearby, their faces blank with the same empty expression that had characterized the missing staff members. They had joined the ranks of the converted, their minds hollowed out and refilled with purposes that served something far beyond human understanding. The patient turned his burning gaze toward Brennan, and the big Irishman felt his finger freeze on the trigger of his weapon. Words formed in his mind, words in that ancient language that conveyed meanings too vast and terrible for normal human thought. He understood, with a clarity that cut through his consciousness like a blade, that the asylum had been transformed into something far more sinister than a medical facility. It had become a gateway, a thin place where the barriers between worlds were breaking down. The treatments would continue, but not as medical procedures. They would serve as the final components in a ritual designed to awaken something that had slept beneath the New Hampshire soil since before humans had walked the Earth. And Margaret Collins, trapped in the chamber below with the empty-eyed remnants of the asylum staff, realized with mounting horror that she was about to witness the completion of a process that would change the fundamental nature of reality itself. The patient had never been trying to escape or be cured. He had been waiting for the proper conditions to summon something from the depths, something that would use Whitmore Asylum as a foothold to enter a world that was utterly unprepared for its presence. The 11th treatment began at the stroke of midnight on October 31st, when the veil between worlds grew thinnest and ancient powers stirred in the depths beneath Whitmore Asylum. Thomas Brennan found himself moving against his will, his hands preparing instruments he had never seen before, devices that seemed to have materialized from the very air around him. The patient no longer needed to be restrained, for he had become something that transcended the need for physical containment. The ritual chamber beneath the asylum had expanded, its stone walls stretching farther into the earth than should have been possible given the building's foundation. Margaret Collins watched in terror as the space around her grew larger with each passing hour, as if reality itself was being reshaped to accommodate whatever was awakening below. The missing staff members continued their silent vigil, their empty eyes reflecting flames that cast no shadows and provided no warmth. Dr. Blackwood moved with mechanical precision, his mind no longer his own but serving as a conduit for knowledge that had existed since before the first humans had looked up at the stars. His hands worked with impossible skill, performing procedures that combined surgery with ritualistic practices drawn from traditions that predated written history. The patient's body had become a canvas upon which ancient symbols were carved, each incision releasing not blood, but streams of light that formed geometric patterns in the air. The 11th treatment involved the removal and replacement of the patient's organs, but not with medical intent. Each organ that was extracted pulsed with its own inner radiance and was replaced with crystalline structures that seemed to grow from the surrounding stone. The patient's heart became a multifaceted gem that beat with rhythms that matched the deep geological processes of the earth itself. His lungs transformed into chambers that breathed not air, but something far more fundamental, the essence that connected all living things. As the transformation progressed, the boundaries between the treatment room and the ritual chamber began to blur. Margaret found herself able to see through the floors and walls, witnessing the procedures above while remaining trapped in the depths below. She watched Dr. Morrison's face age decades in minutes as he transcribed symbols that appeared spontaneously on his medical charts, characters that seemed to write themselves in ink made from shadows and starlight. The patient spoke throughout the 11th treatment, his voice no longer coming from his throat, but emanating from the walls themselves. He told of the first awakening, eons ago when the earth was covered in oceans, and the only land masses were volcanic islands that rose and fell with the tides. He described the beings that had ruled then, creatures of pure will and hunger that had shaped reality according to their desires. These ancient entities had been banished to the spaces between dimensions by forces that the patient referred to only as the architects, beings whose nature was so alien that human language had no words to describe them. The banishment had been incomplete, however, and throughout history, certain locations had remained thin places where the exiled entities could exert influence on the physical world. Whitmore Asylum had been built on one of these nexus points, a location where the Pennacook Indians had once maintained careful rituals to keep the ancient hungers contained. The Shaker community had unknowingly disrupted these protective measures, leading to their conversion and transformation into guardians for something that should have remained sleeping. The asylum's construction had provided the final element, needed for a complete awakening. Thomas Brennan felt his consciousness fragmenting as he assisted with procedures that violated every law of physics and biology he had ever known. The patient's spine was removed and replaced with a structure that resembled crystallized lightning, each vertebra pulsing with electrical energy that seemed to connect him directly to the magnetic field of the earth itself. His nervous system became visible through his translucent skin, glowing with patterns that matched the aurora borealis that had begun appearing in the southern sky above New Hampshire. The 12th treatment commenced at dawn on November 1st, though the sun that rose over Manchester was not the same celestial body that had set the previous evening. Its light had taken on a greenish tinge that cast everything in sickly hues, and its rays seemed to bend and twist as they passed through the asylum's windows. The entire building had begun to change, its Victorian architecture warping into impossible geometries that hurt to perceive directly. Dr. Blackwood's hands moved without conscious direction as he prepared instruments that had no names in any human language. The patient's skull was opened to reveal a brain that had transformed into something resembling a living constellation. Neurons firing in patterns that mapped the positions of stars and galaxies millions of light years away. Each thought that passed through this transformed mind sent ripples through space and time, affecting the behavior of subatomic particles in laboratories around the world. Margaret Collins discovered that she could now understand the symbols that covered the chamber walls, their meanings flowing into her consciousness like water into a dry riverbed. They told the history of the Earth from perspectives that no human had ever imagined, describing the planet as a living entity whose dreams took the form of geological processes and whose nightmares manifested as natural disasters. The patient explained that consciousness itself was far more fundamental than matter, that the physical universe was merely a projection of vast intelligences that existed in dimensions where thought and substance were indistinguishable. Treatments had been designed to transform his physical form into a receiver capable of channeling these entities into the material realm. The 12th treatment involved the replacement of the patient's circulatory system with conduits made from substances that existed partially in multiple dimensions simultaneously. His blood was replaced with fluid that contained the memories of every living creature that had ever died on the land where the asylum stood. The circulation of this transformed blood created currents that reached into the past and future, allowing him to perceive events that had not yet occurred and remember things that had been forgotten before human civilization began. As the procedure progressed, the other patients in the asylum began to change as well. Their various forms of madness were revealed to be incomplete transformations, failed attempts by the ancient entities to establish footholds in human consciousness. Under the influence of the patient's awakening power, these partial conversions began to accelerate and complete themselves. Mrs. Eleanor Hatch, who had been committed for violent delusions about invisible predators, began to see the truth behind her visions. The creatures she had imagined were real, beings from dimensions where light behaved differently and geometry followed rules that human minds could not grasp. Her screams of terror transformed into chants in languages that had never been spoken by human tongues. William Garrison, a former bank clerk whose obsession with numbers had driven him to madness, discovered that his calculations had been attempts to map the mathematical structures that underpinned reality itself. His endless columns of figures suddenly revealed themselves as coordinates for locations in space and time where the barriers between dimensions were weakest. The asylum's remaining staff found themselves changing as well, their exposure to the patient's transforming presence triggering alterations in their own consciousness. Those who had not yet been converted into empty vessels began to experience visions of other worlds, other versions of reality where different physical laws governed the behavior of matter and energy. Dr. Morrison's medical journals began writing themselves filled with anatomical diagrams of creatures that had never existed on Earth, and chemical formulas for substances that could only be created in the cores of dying stars. His hands moved independently of his conscious will, sketching blueprints for devices that could manipulate the fundamental forces of the universe. The 13th treatment began as the transformed sun reached its zenith, casting light that seemed to originate from somewhere beyond the visible spectrum. The patient's physical form had become almost unrecognizable, his flesh translucent and shot through with veins of pure energy. His bones had crystallized into structures that resonated with frequencies that could shatter glass and drive listeners to madness. This final procedure involved the complete dissolution of the barriers between the patient's consciousness and the entities that had been waiting in the spaces between dimensions. His transformed body became a doorway, a living portal through which beings of pure will and hunger could enter the physical world. The asylum itself began to serve as an amplification device, its modified architecture focusing and directing energies that warped the very fabric of space and time. Margaret Collins felt her own transformation beginning as she watched the final stages of the 13th treatment. Her human memories were being overlaid with knowledge that belonged to creatures that had existed since the universe was young. She remembered the birth of stars and the death of galaxies, experienced the slow dance of continents across the Earth's surface, and witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations that had never been recorded in human history. The air in the ritual chamber began to thicken with presence, invisible entities pressing against the boundaries of perception like shapes seen through frosted glass. Margaret could sense their hunger, their desperate need to escape the dimensional prison where they had been confined for eons. The patient had become their key, his transformed body the lock that would open the door between worlds. Thomas Brennan's military training proved useless against horrors that transcended physical reality. His revolver had transformed into something that resembled a weapon but fired projectiles, made from crystallized sound and hardened shadow. He found himself standing guard not against human intruders, but against fragments of sanity that tried to reassert themselves in minds that had been open to cosmic truth. The asylum's walls began to breathe, expanding and contracting with rhythms that matched the patient's transformed heartbeat. Windows became eyes that looked out onto landscapes that existed in parallel dimensions, revealing glimpses of worlds where the ancient entities ruled supreme. The floors became permeable, allowing passage between levels that had not existed in the original architectural plans. As the 13th treatment neared completion, reality itself began to buckle under the strain of forces that had been unleashed. The laws of physics became suggestions rather than absolutes. Gravity flowed like water, and time moved in spirals rather than straight lines. The patient's transformation was nearly complete, his human form serving as an anchor for consciousnesses that were vast beyond measure. But the process required one final component, one last treatment that would complete the ritual and fully open the doorway between dimensions. The 14th treatment would require a sacrifice, not of flesh or blood, but of something far more precious. It would demand the willing surrender of human identity itself, the conscious choice to abandon everything that defined terrestrial existence in favor of communion with entities whose very thoughts could reshape reality. The 14th treatment required no instruments, no medical procedures, only the final surrender of human will to forces that had shaped the cosmos before life began. Margaret Collins found herself walking up stairs that materialized beneath her feet, rising from the ritual chamber to the treatment room where reality had become fluid and malleable. The patient stood at the center of a maelstrom of energy that twisted space into impossible configurations. His transformation was complete, his form now serving as a bridge between dimensions through which ancient consciousnesses poured like water through a broken dam. Dr. Blackwood and the converted staff moved in perfect synchronization, their individual identities dissolved into a collective will that served purposes beyond human comprehension. Thomas Brennan made one final attempt to restore sanity to the asylum, raising his transformed weapon toward the patient. But as he pulled the trigger, he realized that the projectile he fired was not a bullet, but his own memories, his human experiences crystallizing into a fragment of light that was absorbed harmlessly into the patient's radiant form. The 14th treatment was the voluntary merger of human consciousness with cosmic entities. Margaret felt her individual identity dissolving as she approached the patient, her memories and experiences becoming part of a vast tapestry of knowledge that spanned galaxies and eons. She retained enough awareness to understand that she was witnessing the birth of something unprecedented, a fusion of terrestrial and cosmic intelligence that would reshape the fundamental nature of existence. The asylum building began to collapse inward, not through structural failure, but through dimensional compression. The Victorian architecture folded like origami as space itself was restructured to accommodate beings that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Windows became portals to distant stars, corridors stretched into infinity, and the basement ritual chamber expanded to encompass realms that had never known physical matter. As dawn broke on November 2nd, the Whitmore Asylum had vanished from the Manchester landscape, leaving only a circular depression in the earth filled with crystalline formations that pulsed with their own inner light. The local authorities found no trace of the building or its occupants, only reports from nearby residents of aurora displays and gravitational anomalies that had no scientific explanation. The official records listed the asylum's destruction as a gas explosion, though no fragments of the building were ever recovered. The land was declared unsuitable for construction and eventually became a nature preserve where visitors reported unusual phenomena. Compasses spun wildly in the area, electronic devices malfunctioned without cause, and sensitive individuals experienced visions of geometric patterns that seemed to move independently of perception. Dr. Edmund Blackwood was never seen again, though his journals were found in his Manchester residence. The final entries described procedures that violated every principle of medical science, written in handwriting that gradually transformed from English script into symbols that no linguist could decipher. The journals were sealed in the archives of Harvard Medical College, where they remain to this day. Margaret Collins's family received word that she had died in the asylum fire, though no body was recovered. Her sister reported strange dreams in the months following Margaret's disappearance, visions of vast crystalline cities, floating in space where beings of pure thought conducted experiments on the nature of consciousness itself. The other asylums in New Hampshire began reporting unusual patient behaviors in the weeks following Whitmore's disappearance. Individuals with no previous signs of mathematical ability began producing complex equations that described the relationship between matter and consciousness. Patients drew maps of star systems that had not yet been discovered by terrestrial astronomers. Thomas Brennan's military pension continued to be paid to an account that was never accessed, though bank employees reported that the signature cards filed for the account changed monthly, each version written in a different hand using scripts that appeared to be variations of ancient languages. The patient's true identity was never established, though researchers studying the asylum's records discovered references to similar individuals throughout history. Always they appeared at moments of scientific advancement. Always they became the focus of experiments that pushed the boundaries of human knowledge. And always they left behind transformations that altered the fundamental understanding of reality. Today, the site where Whitmore Asylum once stood remains a place where the boundaries between dimensions remain thin. Hikers report seeing buildings that appear and vanish like mirages, hearing sounds of machinery that serves no earthly purpose, and encountering figures dressed in Victorian clothing who speak in languages that convey meanings too vast for human comprehension. The 14th treatment was never documented in any official record, but its effects continue to ripple through the fabric of existence. Modern physicists studying quantum mechanics occasionally discover equations that seem to solve themselves. Medical researchers find that certain patients recover through processes that defy biological explanation, and astronomers detect radio signals from space that carry patterns identical to those found in Dr. Blackwood's final journal entries. In the end, patient number 47 achieved his purpose not through death or cure, but through transformation so complete that the very concepts of life and death ceased to apply. The asylum had served its function as a chrysalis, allowing Something utterly alien to emerge into a universe that would never again operate according to purely terrestrial rules. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.